Hello, today we're joined by retired General Ben Barry, affiliated with IISS. This morning we had a discussion on the future of war. And I wanted to ask you, General, what are some of the key takeaways of the current war in Ukraine in terms of the lessons that NATO can learn from it?
Well, it's a high-intensity war. It's a big war. Big war is back, and it's back with a vengeance. And I'd say the most overriding lesson is the need for competence in combat, because quite early on in the war, Ukraine displayed a much higher level of combat competence than Russia did, particularly in terms of land combined arms tactics and the motivation of its troops, where it outmaneuvered Russia.
Right.
And Russia also displayed a poor level of joint coordination, particularly air-land coordination. Of course, within Europe, there has been a bit of a history of the US finding European national caveats extremely constraining in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there were times when the US thought that European contingents didn't want to fight, and they sometimes saw these contingents as herbivores in a world of carnivores. Well, after Ukraine, no one should have any illusions that it's about combat.
Right.
Vicious, bloody, unpredictable combat. And combat capability and competence is the core capability of armed forces.
To attain. If you look at the war in Ukraine, there's also a debate on the role of maneuver versus attrition. What lessons are to be learned there?
Well, we've seen quite a lot of manoeuvre, and we shouldn't forget, actually, that early on Russia did some very successful land manoeuvre. I mean, it rapidly pushed out north and south from the Donbass, and also its forces in Crimea rapidly pushed the Ukrainians out of much of the Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts, which the Ukrainians are yet to evict them from. Russia also showed some very good retrograde manoeuvre. When it decided to shut down the attack on Kiev, it withdrew very quickly and with very few casualties from Ukrainian following up. When it decided to withdraw from Kherson, it basically withdrew 2 divisions over one night over a damaged bridge. So it's displayed some competence at manoeuvring. I mean, so has Ukraine with the offensive out of Kharkiv about a year ago, and also evicting the Russians from Kherson. So manoeuvre has been a big part of the war. More recently, with the counter-offensive, it's been more restricted owing to the depth of the Russian defences and minefields, and also Ukraine's reluctance to take much risk in order to reduce casualties. What I think we've also seen, but imperfectly, is Ukraine waging a deep battle where they're manoeuvring fire around missiles, HIMARS, drones, special forces, partisans, proxy forces. And so they are attempting to achieve deep manoeuvre in Crimea and Russia itself. So manoeuvre is certainly a valid component of air-land warfare.
Super. We're talking about the physical domains. Manoeuvring also has a non-physical aspect. Could you talk about the non-physical domains?
Well, I think there's 2 aspects. There's cyber and electronic warfare, and then there's information operations. Well, there's abundant evidence that Russian electronic warfare capability at times posed considerable problems for Ukraine, jamming their drones, jamming their precision artillery. And I suspect this is a much-needed reminder that electronic warfare can be very powerful, provided, of course, it's linked to signals intelligence, and provided it's used in accordance with the commander's tactical plan. It seems to me that in NATO, armies and air forces well understand this, and ships and aircraft are well provided with EW systems. Where there's a lacuna is in the land component, where the EW is much more dispersed. And I suspect we're going to see future NATO armies having much more in the way of electronic warfare capability.
Right.
Then cyber. I mean, quite clearly the war began with Russian cyber attacks on Ukrainian government and Ministry of Defence infrastructure, which were seen off both by Ukraine's experienced cyber defenders and the international coalition of Ukraine's supporters, and indeed business. Microsoft got hugely involved in this and actually deployed a team into Kiev to help Ukraine do this. I think it's unlikely, though, that cyber is going to be very easy to use as a tactical tool to integrate with battle-space manoeuvre. Indeed, the British Army chief has said, well, you can't cyber your way across a river. The reason I think is that to do anything in the cyber environment, you have to penetrate the target networks. And that usually requires a lot of time, and you also want to do it in conditions of great secrecy, so you can gather intelligence from those networks. So the idea that cyber is a magic key that will unlock the battlefield is, I think, misplaced. But what I think you do need is you need a sort of gearing between the cyber organisation and your cyber capabilities, who may well not necessarily be military, they could be your national SIGINT agency. But you need a gearing between them and the military headquarters and the people doing battle space manoeuvre.
Right.
And if you don't have that and you don't train with it, well, you're not going to be able to use cyber at all. So it's very important that becomes part of NATO's way of doing business.
Another non-physical domain, if you like, is part of cyber is the information domain. And the Ukrainians have proven to be very agile and very adept at operating in the information domain, both in the theater, but also with extra theater, strategic geopolitical ramifications. What are your views on that?
Well, I think you're right. President Zelensky has been a master at this himself, with his remarks very carefully tailored to particular audiences. But the Ukrainian military has put a lot of effort into this. So, for example, if you look at the videos they've released of the war, they've actually been carefully tailored. Early in the war, what they were showing was brave light infantry with NLAWs and with Javelin missiles against this sort of Soviet-style juggernaut that was the Russian forces. They didn't show Ukrainian tanks or armoured vehicles. They wanted to amplify how useful NLAW and Javelin were. Right now, it's very easy for the international media to go and visit frontline Ukrainian brigades and see what they're doing with comparatively little constraint. But Ukraine's deep battle, the attacks by cruise missiles, by drones, by long-range artillery rockets and special forces and saboteurs, the international media by and large doesn't have access to that. And all we learn about is what Ukraine tells us and what's picked up on Russian social media. So this does show that manoeuvring in the information space is a mainstream military activity, and there are positive and negative aspects to it. Now, when in the IISS we look at NATO's military capabilities, we see very few information operations capabilities. In fact, the only ones we've got in our database right now are UK and US. The British Army's got an information operations brigade, 77 Brigade. The US have a number of psychological operations brigade, and the Air Force has a small squadron of Commando Solo airborne broadcasting stations.
Right.
So although NATO has made a lot of rhetoric about the importance of manoeuvring in the information domain, its actual capability to do it seems pretty limited right now.
Right, and we're also having this debate in Europe, on the continent, within the Netherlands even, as to how to set up such a unit and under what conditions it may operate. So I think there's more to become on that front. If we talk about the different domains, we see land battle. We've seen a lot of wars over the past 30 years, or the wars that have been fought had a strong air component. The air component is a bit different here. What about the maritime domain?
I think there's a historical deficit of analysis of major state-on-state maritime campaigns. In fact, the last time there was a matched state-on-state maritime campaign was the Falklands War in 1982, which is, I think, worth studying, and there were multi-domain aspects to the Falklands War as well. It seems to me that while NATO benefited from a great progress in air-land integration in Afghanistan, and I hope has sustained that, there's probably more of an air gap in maritime land integration, not so much with marine forces, but in bigger integration between armies and navies. And it's not clear to me that there's the same degree of integration between navies and air forces. I would say, though, that there's a different way of looking at this, which is the proliferation of drones, mostly drones in the air, but also increasingly sea drones.
Water, yeah.
Because what you see happening is a Ukrainian brigade with a company of drones basically has its own private air force, able to do ISR, and also a degree of kinetic attack. You see the same with the sea drones. The Ukrainians are using this. Well, might you design armies and navies in the future to have much more in the way of unmanned air systems, which they would control themselves, which would make air-land integration and air-maritime integration more organic and possibly less bureaucratic and procedural than it is right now.
Okay. A couple of years ago we met on a panel on urban conflict. So perhaps by means of conclusion we can talk also about the terrains. What are some of the insights here that we see emerge from?
Well, terrain matters. In the initial battles, Ukrainian defenders took very good advantage of woods, of boggy terrain, of rivers, and also of the dormitory towns around Kiev that stopped the Russian forces breaking through into Kiev. There's also been urban fighting in southern and eastern Ukraine, like Kherson, and in the Donbass. So the world's in the midst of a global megatrend of globalization, and it's about 15 years since the number of people living in urban environments exceeded the number of people living in rural environments, and this is just going to grow and grow. So the political and economic significance of urban areas, as well as the way they provide transport nodes, means that urban warfare is going to become more and more important in the future. And I'm afraid armed forces that aren't competent in urban warfare should increasingly be seen as incompetent.
Okay. It's a lot to digest. Thank you for your views. But if we can ask you, what is for you one of the key implications for NATO as an alliance on the base of these trends that you've identified and lessons that can be gleaned from the war?
Well, we've had a really stimulating morning with a lot of interesting speakers. But it seems to me that NATO needs to have a concept of operations for the forward defence of European territory. And that has to, juggle with some difficult contradictory factors like the vulnerability of troops that are right up at the border and the issues of integrating air forces and land forces. But this concept of defence probably needs to be dynamic and involve counterattacks right from the start, and air operations, for example, into enemy territory from the very beginning. But I think it needs to be set out in clear and understandable ways so it can be understood throughout NATO and its national forces, and then it can be trained and exercised against. So a military concept for the forward defence of European territory that is usable and can be used, I think would be really useful.
Excellent. Thank you very much, General.
My pleasure.